Welcome everybody. I hope your first day on the sea is good. We sailed from Charleston just a day ago and so far it looks like smooth sailing, so we're delighted to have you on board and delighted to have you here for this first of 6 lectures on the journey through sexuality and aging. While I am a sex therapist and an author, I'm more like your tour guide for this. I'm going to be giving you a lot of information as we go along. I'll be giving you lectures, these lectures, but I'm also available to be able to talk as you see me on deck and as we have dinner. And I probably won't know all the answers to the questions you ask, but I have a lot of resources and be glad to try to track them down. And we're going to have a lot of fun. I teach, for most of my time, I teach in a medical center, and we teach people who don't laugh a lot and don't seem to have a lot of fun. They're very serious about what they're doing, but I want you all to have fun. If we're not having fun during this, then we're going to find a way to kick things up a little bit. So I want to tell you, first of all, a little bit about me, because sometimes folks wonder, how does anybody get to be a sex therapist, and what are they doing here talking to me about this? Well, the first thing is that I grew up in a pretty traditional background in a small community in the southeastern part of the United States, in a pretty traditional home with parents who slept in twin beds, which always makes me wonder where I came from. Somebody must have crossed the void there at some point, at least twice, because I have an older brother. I was always curious about sex as I was growing up, but becoming a sex therapist was not part of my childhood dream. There were no such people as Dr. Ruth, who many of you all remember, and now Dr. Laura and all the various other people who are the faces of sex therapy. I just wanted to be a nurse, and I did become a nurse, but out of becoming a nurse and then becoming a nurse practitioner, I began to work with people who had a lot of sexual issues, and one thing led to another, and now I've been in this for almost 35 years, working full-time as a nurse and working in the field of sex therapy, and I've worked with lots and lots of people with lots and lots of stories. I myself was a late bloomer sexually, by today's standards anyway. I was in my 20s before I had my first sexual experience with another person, and I'm really glad about that. I kind of worry when people start much too young today, so I'm kind of glad about that. I met my husband by the side of the railroad tracks on the border of Austria and Switzerland in the summer of 1967, and we married 2 months later, which doesn't give you a whole lot of time to get to know the other person, but it's worked out well, and we're getting ready to have our 45th anniversary, and some people think I've gotten a lot of extra points in heaven for some of the things I've put up with, but it's all good, and we've journeyed together and we've learned a lot from each other. At the start of a recent cruise that I was on with him, I gave him an ultimatum. We had been in New York for 2 days prior to this cruise. We were going to be sailing out of there, and he's kind of a type A+++ personality. He doesn't know the meaning of the word slow. Everything is, let's go fast. Let's move along as fast as we can. So for 2 days in New York City, literally the only way I could keep up with him was for me to hook my finger in the back of his belt loop, and he pulled me through New York City. So for 48 hours, I had been pulled like that. So we get to where the ship is going to be embarking, and we get ready to go up the gangplank, and I'd had enough of being pulled. I turned to him, his name is John, I turned to him and I said, John, I need to tell you something. I said, as soon as we go up this gangplank and walk onto this ship, I'm planning on having an affair with the first person that I see who doesn't walk fast. And I said, and I really hope that that person is you. But I did have an affair with him. Because what happens when we go on cruises sometimes is that people can completely change from that busy person that they are all the time to be able to slow down and to be able to invest in maybe another side of a relationship that they had not paid attention to before. So I think we're going to have a lot of fun on this cruise. I think we're going to learn a lot, and hopefully the person that you're with, the person that you came on the ship with and that you're going to leave the ship with will be somebody that you'll have a lot deeper and more enriched relationship by the time the cruise is over. So why are we offering this course? This is a new thing for cruise ships to offer. You know, we've had all kinds of other lectures on cruise ships, but we haven't necessarily had lectures about sexuality. Well, seniors, who are the people who take most of these kind of cruises, are the fastest growing segment of society. We're outnumbering all the young people. It's going to be kind of top heavy with older folks. And secondly, the expectations about sexuality in today's older population differ from earlier times. You know, my folks, my father actually died when he was 60, and my mother was a widow from the time she was 50 on. She never had another relationship. She didn't date. Her sex life ended when she was 50. That's not true in today's population. People are staying sexually active even into their hundreds, which some people say that couldn't happen, but it can, and it does. So it's very different, and we're going to talk about some of those specific expectations as we go along. And then the third reason is that everybody has a story about their sexuality. Either a story of something wonderful that happened, or something funny that happened, or something tragic that happened. And what often happens in relationships is that people don't tend to share their stories with the person that they're closest to. They might share their story with a therapist or with a girlfriend, or guys don't ever share their stories unless they're kind of trying to one-up somebody else. We all have a story. We all bring our background to whatever relationship we're in. And you can't look at just the way the body parts work without the context of the person's entire story. And we won't get into a lot of that in this lecture, but I will touch on that in some of the lectures down the way. And then cruise ship passengers have more time than any other segment of the population to work on their personal relationships. And we're going to have fun. And you don't need to turn in any homework on this cruise. You're welcome to do as much happy homework as you want to do. That's encouraged. But I don't want you turning it in. And if you do, it won't be graded. People laugh about senior sexuality, and I'm sure all these jokes that I'm getting ready to show you are ones that you've seen. They're not anything new. Old is when your sweetie says, "Let's go upstairs and make love." And you answer, "Pick one. I can't do both." Old is when getting lucky means you find your car in the parking lot. Love-making tips for seniors. Wear your glasses to make sure your partner's actually in the bed. Set your timer for 3 minutes in case you doze off in the middle. Write your partner's name on your hand in case you can't remember it. True? So why are we laughing? Because all jokes have an element of fear and an element of truth. Society seems to think it's fun to make fun of seniors and sex. That's going to change as we all keep getting older and we outnumber the younger group, but so far right now. But mainly, some of these really do hit home. While we're joking, I want you to begin to think about what is your story. And what is it about your story that you bring to the relationship you're in right now that makes things wonderful, or maybe that causes a problem? And there may be things that you haven't ever thought about, or things that you've thought about a lot and you wish that you could talk to somebody else about. And by the end of this lecture, you'll have the words, hopefully, to be able to do that. I want you to begin to think about who wrote your book of love. Do you remember that song by the Monotones back in the 60s? Oh, I wonder, wonder who, who wrote your book of love? I tried to put this in iTunes. My iTunes wouldn't work, so you were going to have that actual rather than having me sing, but it's much better to have me sing it, obviously. But we all have a book of love, and if you've never really thought about it, never really written that down, some of the time on the cruise might be a good time to begin to just make some notes about what happened as you were growing up. How were you shaped? How were you shaped for better or for worse? We were all shaped by people who were shaped by the people in their backgrounds. And so my background has been 6 or 7 generations of Northern Europeans that have lived in the Southern United States, but somebody else's may be a first-generation immigrant, and somebody else may be from a completely other part of the world. So you bring all that shaping in that either works for you or doesn't work for you. And sometimes people need to think about what happened that shouldn't have happened and what needed to happen that didn't. And for a lot of people, what needed to happen that didn't is maybe they didn't get words to be able to talk about sexuality. Maybe they were told to be silent, and maybe they were told to never speak about certain things. I'm going to ask you to think about when did you find your sexual voice and how? And that won't be in today's lecture, but that'll be on down the road. Because the most important thing about sexual well-being in general is that silence is the greatest risk. That society, you would often think when you hear and read some of the discussions that are going on today, is that we should not talk about sex. We shouldn't talk about sexuality. In the particular part of the United States that I live in, there's been a huge focus in our legislature to try to get school teachers to not talk about what's called gateway behaviors, the kinds of things that people could do that would lead them into other kinds of sexual activity. So those of us who work in the fields go, well, is a gateway behavior saying hello? Is it kissing? Is it holding hands? What are all those kinds of things? And I think that we are really harming our children when we fail to give them information and fail to allow them to speak. So if silence is the greatest risk to our sexual well-being, the second most important thing is to be able to breathe. Breathing is absolutely essential for sex. You cannot hold your breath and have a positive sexual experience. Now, I couldn't find a good picture about breathing and having sex. The closest I could come was breathing and swimming, but it's the same kind of thing. You can't really swim for very long holding your breath. You can do it for a while, but you've got to learn to be able to breathe. And the third most important thing is that sex for people over a certain age, certainly for women and most of the time for men, is for recreation. It's for having fun. It's not for making babies. There are some men in their older life who are making babies, but for the most part, those who are pretty smart are not, because that's a lot of investment if you're going to start a whole other family. So it's about having fun, and that's what the focus of this is going to be on, the ways that we can increase our fun and recreate. So let's look real quickly at a couple of myths. First of all, society seems to believe that most men over 60 who have sex need to be on Viagra or some other erection aid medicine, and you'd think the whole world needed to be on it if you watch any of the television commercials every night. It's some kind of commercial for something, and that's been true since 1998. If you think about it, we are now 14 years, if this is 2012, we're 14 years into this. There's a whole generation of children who growing up who never knew what it was like to not be bombarded with that and to hear all about that. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? A second myth is that most women over 60 don't want to have sex anymore, and that most people over 70 rarely have sex, and if their people are in their 80s or 90s, they may have some memory of having had sex, but if they talk about any kind of current experience, it's a function of their dementia. Now, that could be true, and sometimes people exaggerate, but the truth is that sexuality is lifelong. It's from conception to grave. There are gradual changes that take place. This is a good news, bad news segment that I'm coming up with now. There are gradual changes that take place from 50 to 70. So those of you all who are in the 50 to 70 category, and maybe you've had, one or two dings on the scale of perfection, things do begin to change at 70, sometimes sooner, sometimes later, but they're much more pronounced after 70. But the things that really make a difference is that the state of health. Obviously, the more healthy you are, the more in physical shape you are, the better you're going to be able to engage in sexual activity, and the status of your relationship. These are the two key factors that determine a person's sexual health over the age of 70. So I'm not going to take a poll here, but it looks like there might be a few people in here who are over the age of 70, maybe some who might even be older than that. What we're aware of is that there are three groups of seniors, and actually as I was just thinking about this earlier today, I think we really have four groups of seniors. We have the 60 to 70 age group, we have the 70 to 80, we have the 80 to 90, and we have the 90 and older. We don't really have words to describe what those are. We're calling the ones who are born between 46 and 64, we're calling baby boomers. Then those between 32 and 45, which is where I fit, are pre-boomers. And then those before 1932 are elderly, but I kind of don't like to use the term elderly because I'm going to be getting there pretty soon and I don't want to be called elderly. So here's what I think. I think we have four categories. We have true freshmen, those are the 60 to 70s. We have the sophomores who are 70 to 80. We have the juniors who are 80 to 90, and then we have true seniors. And that's what I'm going to start calling people, are true seniors, who are people over 90, because I don't like elderly. I taught a course earlier this year where people told me never to use the word old, and so I'm trying to not do that. And I think I'm going to do the same thing with elderly. But regardless of whatever group we're in, since the 60s, the boomers and everybody else in that 60 and over group, we've all been influenced by the effects of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We just can't avoid it. So let's go back just a little bit and look at anybody in San Francisco in the summer of 1967. Anybody in this group there? Well, neither was I, because I was rocking around Europe, meeting my husband, getting pregnant along the way. You know, might as well have been in San Francisco, but I wasn't. So the period between 1967 and August of 1969 was the absolute epicenter of the sexual revolution. There were things that happened during that period of time that have forever changed us. Whether or not we were anywhere close to any of that, or we knew anybody that was close to that, we've all been affected by that. Part of that is that we've had this enormous increase of the use of recreational drugs and marijuana and other kinds of recreational drugs. Alcohol has been legitimized in places that it was never legal before, so you can get a drink just about anywhere now. You can buy alcohol just about anywhere. There are medications available to prevent pregnancy, so we've had a whole reproductive medications available, as well as other ways to prevent pregnancy. And this whole cultural shift that's focused on sort of an idealized view of youth. Now, if you remember, people back at that period of time sort of looked like one of these two versions. The thing was, don't trust anybody over 30 and make love, not war. Well, we've kind of changed, we've gotten all back to that again. We've got people out demonstrating in the streets who are wearing tie-dyes, who look like this, and who want us to make love, not war. They want us to occupy whatever it is we're supposed to occupy and not make war. But everything tends to go around. I was not a huge Beatles fan, but I have friends whose whole lives were defined by the Beatles, and this Sgt. Pepper Club album cover from the 60s kind of illustrates the way things were at that time. So let's look at where some of these people are now. Well, Bob Dylan and Neil Young and the Rolling Stones and The Who and Pink Floyd, they're all still out there, still touring. They don't look so good anymore, some of them, but they're out there still doing it. Unfortunately, John Lennon and George Harrison are gone, but Ringo and Paul are still busy. And Elvis, bless his heart, he's making more money now than he ever made in the 60s. So just for a moment, let's kind of shift and look at what we know from, there have been a fair number of studies, through the ages, but until 2010, we didn't have a really good picture of what sexuality in general looked like, and particularly what it looked like for this group from 60 and over. What we learned is that people engage in a broad range of sexual activity throughout their entire lives. And this came from a study that sampled about 98% of all households. So we know that this is not just in certain parts of the country, but pretty true throughout. We know that solo activity, masturbation, occurs in lots of older people, but partnered experiences also occur, and they pretty much do the same thing that people in all age groups do. And this one I think is really striking. This is a way that there's a huge difference in this generation from younger generations, and that is that older people commonly now take on new partners after the loss of a mate. You don't see very many people living throughout their old life, if they're widowed young or separated young, without taking on a new mate. I talked earlier about the ways that some of the expectations about sexuality have changed and differ from earlier times. We've got medicines available now to enhance physical capabilities, prescription medications for erectile dysfunction. I got into the field of working with people's sexual health in the 1970s, about 1975, and there was nothing available. People needed something, they would ask for something, and we didn't have anything. So I lived long enough to be able to see the Viagras and the other medications begin to come on the scene, and to see how that's revolutionized the way people deal with erection problems. We also have now a whole expanded range of sexual enhancement products, things like vibrators and lubricants and all kinds of consumer marketing messages that shape people's expectations. That may be good, it may be not so good, but earlier generations, it wasn't that they didn't have those. Vibrators have been around as long as man or woman has been able to find something that they could use to stimulate themselves. The thing that's made the difference is the use of electricity. When electricity came along, it changed a vibrator from being something that a person manually controlled to being something that could have an extra pulsation because of the electric power. And so whether it's battery operated or you plug it into the wall, that's been a huge change. But that's been almost 100 years now that we've had these kinds of devices. We also people have far more opportunities now for their sex lives to extend, and for some people that's good, and for some people that's not good, because sometimes there's pressure to keep going. The opportunities, along with the expectations, have increased because people are living longer and they're living in better health, and sometimes it's positive and sometimes it's not so positive, depending on how a person feels about the pressure that they may be under to have sexual experiences later in life. So let's look at what some of those experiences are, and this is another good news, bad news sort of thing. From the national study, we learned that the frequency of vaginal intercourse peaks for men between 25 and 39. I don't think we have anybody here in the audience that falls below 39, so all you guys have passed your peak. But it's even worse for women. For women, it peaks between 20 and 29. So we're all past our peak from that standpoint, but that doesn't mean that we're past the enjoying experiences, because what we know is that 2/3 of men and women over age 50 continue to engage in penile vaginal intercourse 1 or more times a month, so at least 12 times a year, 2/3 of men and women. But by age 70, that changes. You remember I said earlier between 50 and 70, there's gradual things. By 70, only about 23% of women and 43% of men are having regular or having any kind of penile vaginal intercourse. What we can all understand is that sometimes there's not somebody available, sometimes health is interfered, but for whatever reason, there is a big drop-off after about age 70. Now, what's true across all age groups is that having sex with yourself, a friend of mine calls that making love to someone that you love. So depending on what your story is about masturbation, whether you were told this is a good thing, a bad thing, or you weren't told anything about it, masturbation is the most prevalent sexual activity across all ages. Most men over age 50 and about half of the women over age 50 reported masturbating in the past year. Now, one thing that I will say about this is that if you have never been a person who has masturbated, it is important to think about engaging in this behavior later on in life. And for a lot of people, that means getting past your story. Whatever, all those things that are going on in your head that say this is not a good thing to do, and any of those kinds of things, because it takes far more of a hands-on experience to be able, for your body to be able to experience sexual pleasure later on in life. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes when I get to the portion of this lecture that I call the assisted loving part. But just remember this. Remember that your story can get in the way of this. Single men and women, this would kind of be obvious, single men and women reported a higher frequency of masturbation and a lower frequency of all other behaviors than their partner counterparts. Well, duh. If you don't have somebody to be with, then you're with yourself. So what are some of those other sexual experiences? Well, what we know is that anal sex is becoming a part of the mainstream repertoire for the people between the ages of 25 and 50, has not entered the repertoire so much for people over the age of 50. But this group, this 25 to 50 group, in another 30 years, it's going to be a mainstream activity as a part of what they do. Not very many older Americans engage in that now, but oral sex, mouth to genital sex, you're going to hear me talk about another kind of oral sex a little bit later on, but oral sex, mouth to genital stimulation is much more mainstream, and it's also increasing in the older population. However, here's another good news, bad news sort of thing. The frequency of oral sex decreased about 8% a year for men and 7% for women. And as with everything else, people with poor health reported more solo masturbation and frottage. Frottage is an interesting word. We used to call that humping or rubbing up against or dry sex. But the studies, in order to use correct words, call this frottage. And this gives me an opportunity to talk about the words. The language of sexuality is fraught with so many euphemisms, so many words that we use instead of saying what something is, like masturbation, like vagina, like penis. I mean, we all grew up with a whole variety of other words other than that. And so what I've learned over the years is that I might be talking to this person or this person and this person, and might be using really nice, clean, clinical language, and they don't have any clue what I'm talking about because they're used to calling it a dick or a cunt or some other word like that that might not be a part of everyday language. For the most part in these lectures, I'm going to use the correct terminology, but you may hear me sometimes begin to use the street language or the more vernacular language because that's what we tend to use in talking with each other. And I'm not using that to be offensive, but using it just to say that that's just the way we talk about this. In this study, they called it frottage. So here, let's look at what happens with drugs. We talked about sex, now we're talking about drugs. 25% of men and 13% of women reported alcohol use prior to their most recent sexual experience. That's not a real good thing because alcohol use interferes with, it decreases a person's ability to function sexually. So if you're thinking about having a really nice romantic time here on the cruise ship or somewhere else, don't have very much to drink. What we know is that men over 50 are using some erection medication. And if you're using that along with alcohol, it's probably going to be at odds with each other. About 7.5% of men over the age of 50 before they're 60 use some kind of erection medication. As they get older, they need more, 30% of men age 60 to 69 and 23%, and then on up to age 80 with 18%. People said that in general, their sexual experiences were good if they were with a partner. But for men, bad news is that problems with arousal and problems with orgasm. Now, I don't have to tell any of you men who are in here that it gets more difficult to be able to get an erection and more difficult to be able to keep it, and that you have more difficulty being able to have orgasms as you get older. But men don't tend to talk about that very much, and what a lot of men do is they just quit trying to engage in sexual activity. They may go and get a prescription for Viagra, but what we know is that first prescriptions for Viagra don't get refilled except in about 30% of cases because somebody gets it, they find out that it didn't just bring on this wonderful erection all by itself, and that without a little bit of help, things are not going to be that much different. And all they're going to get is a magnificent headache instead of getting an erection in the other head that they wanted to get. Men in poor health had much more difficulty. They had pain and they had erection difficulties. And women experienced difficulty with lubrication and with orgasm and with arousal. So those are just some of the issues that happen. Now, I want you to pay attention. This is probably the most important slide up here that came from this research. And I want you to read it, and then I'm going to try to go through it. 80% of women who said that their most recent experience had been with a non-relationship partner, they had higher arousal and less lubrication difficulties compared to women whose most recent experience was with a partner. Now, ladies, boredom is not a good thing. Being with somebody different can be a good thing, in your mind anyway, because people tend to have more arousal that way. But so what happens if you're with the same guy you've been with for 50 years and you don't want to go with somebody else? well, you're going to have to make some changes, and we'll talk about that a little later on. But I think this is striking. I think all of us know, that women, that in our fantasy lives, that's why this book that's out right now, 50 Shades of Grey, which I've not read, and everybody keeps asking me if I have, but it's about a variety of different kinds of extramarital relationships and all kinds of relationships. And women are reporting getting aroused by that. They get aroused with the thought of something that's a little bit different. So while women reported that things got a lot better for them if they were actually or in a fantasy basis with somebody different, men found that they had more difficulty reaching orgasm if they were not with a partner. And I will tell you additionally, men are also at greater risk for getting heart attacks if they're not with a regular partner. So it's an interesting thing to think about, because people tend to sometimes be with a non-relationship partner looking for things to get better. It works for women. It doesn't work so well for men. Women actually, when they were asked whether they would stay in a relationship that wasn't much fun, women said, well, yeah, we're going to continue to be active, even though it's not much arousing or sometimes it's painful. Women are loyal. They said in the study, they don't know why. Women are pretty loyal. I think that's why. Men, however, tend to leave and look for more pleasure, and they reported higher levels of pleasure in non-partnered relationship. One more thing, and then we're going to kind of get through the academic part and talk about how to make things better. But because people are having sex with varieties of partners outside of their primary relationship, particularly if they're moving into new senior housing and they have a variety of partners available, what we are learning is that people are not being safe. They're not using condoms. If you look at this, only about 20% of men and 24% of women tended to use condoms when they were with a new partner. The interesting thing is that men, if they were paying for sex, we call that transactional sex, if they were having sex that they were paying for, they did tend to use condoms more. If you go to see a physician, about more than 60% of people are not asked by their physicians whether they're using any kind of condoms or protection. So, bringing it back to rock and roll, and then we're going to talk about some of the ways things can change. Some people have said that the seniors' theme song needs to be, "You've lost that loving feeling." That may or may not be true. What we know is that many seniors, however, do download their favorite music with iTunes if they can figure out how to use the technology. But we sometimes need hearing aids to listen to it, and it ain't so easy to do the twist anymore once you've had a hip replacement. So where did all these young years go? Well, here's the young woman that you saw earlier, and she's living in a hut, but she's still looking to make love, not war. And this guy's gotten a job in industry now, and he's become kind of the pillar of the community, and his big wonder is there any sex after 65? But a lot of times what seniors also want to know is, what time of day are the senior specials offered? Or in my part of the country, the blue hair specials. What is it the seniors really want to know? Well, women want to know if they're ever going to find a love again, and guys want to know, will I ever get it up again? So what does all this mean? It means that while there's not much risk of pregnancy later on in life, there is risk of infection if you don't know who your prior partner has been with, and that you should never disregard the effect of a new relationship on the ability to spark old feelings. If you're in an aging coupleship and things are boring, how are you going to make things better? That's where a lot of people on cruises find themselves, if they're with somebody that they've been with forever and ever and ever. Well, for one thing, they have to communicate. And any of you who have heard me speak know that I call this true oral sex. Before we were talking about oral sex that's mouth to genital, but true oral sex is when you use your mouth to connect with somebody else's ears and you talk about what's going on. You tell your story, they tell their story, and you find your voice and you're able to speak up. Like I was able to speak up to my husband. If we'd gotten on the cruise ship and spent 12 days on a cruise ship for which we paid a lot of money, and neither of us were happy and we weren't able to enjoy one another, that would have been pretty awful. But over the years, I got my voice and I was able to say, hey, things have got to change, and this is not going to be okay to do what we're doing. You have to be able to have true oral sex. You got to be flexible. You got to be able to change your mind and be creative. Doing the same things over and over are just not going to work. You need to be supportive to each other. One of the things that's so sad to me about many of the couples that I talk with is that when one or the other person begins to age, begins to have issues with health in general, and then begins to have sexual function issues, oftentimes there's no talking, so there's no true oral sex going on, but people don't know how to be supportive to each other, and because they haven't had years and years and years of that kind of relationship building up. You need to be honest. A relationship cannot grow if there's not honesty there. And sometimes that takes an awful lot of courage to look somebody in the eye and say, hey, this thing that you've been doing for 40 years that was really a lot of fun 40 years ago, it's just not working too well for me anymore, and we've got to find some other things to do. The numbers of people that I've worked with who said, I just don't know how to tell him or her that. Well, you got to do it, and that can be a real change within a relationship. You got to be able to have fun. This is about recreational sex. And in my view, it's something that I call assisted loving. We might not be old enough for assisted living, but we can all benefit from changes in our loving. So let's look at some specifics about what that assisted loving might look like. And in some of the later lectures, I'm going to be talking much more specific. So this is just sort of an overview of some of the things about that. Sex in older age is much more it's much more a hands-on experience. We've got to be able to touch one another, physically touch one another. If you've not been in a relationship where you've done anything more than touch lips maybe, and to touch genitals enough to make babies, you've got to be able to touch, you've got to caress, you've got to be able to directly stimulate the male and female genitals. It's not going to work if you don't. And so if you've been squeamish about touching your mate's penis, or he's been squeamish about touching her vagina or any of the other parts of her body, you got to be able to do that. You've got to take one another on a tour and show where everything is. Hopefully, we've all benefited. Many of us, I always go back to the scene in the movie Fried Green Tomatoes when the women were sitting around and looking at their vaginas with a mirror. Well, most of us in this age group, most of the women went through that experience in the 70s or the 80s, but sometimes we've forgotten where things are, or we never bothered to show anybody else where it was. This is the time to take the tour and invite him or her to go on the tour. Let's see where everything is. Maybe it's been reconfigured. I mean, I just had a hysterectomy, and everything's been reconfigured, and we kind of have to figure out how to do all this again because it doesn't feel the same, it doesn't work the same. It's a good time to take the tour again, so that's got to happen. And then, as I always say, I take this from my friends who are in the real estate business. Probably the most important thing for assisted loving is lubrication, lubrication, lubrication. If things are not moist, and most of the time they're not going to be moist naturally after a certain age, certainly after menopause, that's all going to change. You got to be able to use some lubrication. And I usually tell people that the best lubrication is probably what you already have in your pantry at home, because you probably have some canola oil, some olive oil, maybe you even have some various other kinds of oil there. But if you don't have a good kind of oil, any oil that you can put into your mouth is usually really good to use. Go to the grocery store. Go see what's on the shelf. Maybe you don't like olive oil. Maybe you'd like to use some almond oil, or any of those are okay. And the thing is, if they don't work so well to enhance your lovemaking, you can always make salad out of them. So it's not going to be like they're just going to go to waste. Don't buy the super duper size jar though, because oils tend to get rancid over time. Buy a smaller jar and then go back and get it again. I mean, if you're using it up, 15 times a week, then you might need the super duper. I don't know, but lubrication is really important. You got to be able to be creative and flexible in your body and mind. That might mean starting to do yoga. I cannot do yoga. I'm a yoga failure, but I still give it a try because my hips don't work so well. If your hips don't work so well, you got to do things to be able to move them, to get them open. And I'm really looking for somebody to come out with yoga for sex. I think it would be a great thing to do. We've had yoga for golf. We have yoga for pregnant moms. We have all kinds of various yoga. I think yoga for old life sex. So somebody out there may want to take that up as their next thing to do. It may mean that you need to find a different time of day. You may even need to set an alarm to remind you when. Mid-morning and mid-afternoon are really great times. Early in the morning is not so good because our bodies are not working too well at that point. We don't have sometimes very much flexibility in our bodies. It may take a while to kind of get things going. By nighttime, you may be mostly just thinking about going to bed. But seniors, and particularly people on cruises, have a fair amount of flexibility and availability in the mid-morning or mid-afternoon, unlike people who have children in the household, in which it is a miracle that they ever manage to have sex, if you think about that. One of my early professors used to say that he didn't see how anybody who had a child under the age of 6, that child ever got a brother or sister, because it's just too much going on. You may need to think about a different kind of place or a different way to make the place more comfortable. Beds work great. They're still the best place, but you may need to get a new mattress. You may need to think about making love in a chair or having some cushions. Anything, because our bodies change. We don't have the same degree of joint flexibility, and those are all fine. There's nothing wrong with any of that. And if you've always been doing it the same way, then it's time to make a change. You may need to use some sexual enhancements. I've already talked a little bit about oil. You may need music. It's amazing to me the kinds of music that people find sort of arousing. There's a whole series of classic love music, a 4-part series that if you listen to it, the classic music in that has such a crescendo property to it that builds up to orgasm, and it really does if you listen to it and listen to the rhythm of it. But there are other people who are equally aroused by gospel music or by Elvis music or rock and roll. Rock and roll was the classic music that had the rhythms of sex in it, and that's why some of our parents, particularly our fairly straight-laced parents, did not want us dancing to or moving our bodies in the way that rock and roll talked about. And then you may need to use, as one person said, the 3 little blue pills. 2 Advil for her and 1 Viagra for him was the way one person put it. We just may need those kinds of assistances, and if so, you have to plan. This cannot be a spontaneous experience. You got to have true oral sex, talk about this, and then you got to be planning this. And then you've got to hope that neither one of you gets mad at the other one during whatever the 45-minute window of time is there. So this is fairly complicated sometimes. You need to be able to experiment with positions and activities, looking at giving and receiving oral sex, and in this case I'm talking about mouth-to-genital sex, and using vibrators, both for men and for women. There's a woman who has made her entire career has been devoted to teaching women to have orgasm. Her name is Dr. Betty Dodson, and she's in her 80s now, and she is still teaching women and writing about how women need to be able to teach themselves to reach orgasm. Most of the people in the 60 to 75 age group have had a lot of instruction in that because we lived through the sexual revolution. But if you didn't get it then, it's not too late. It's still possible. And I literally remember a woman who, after her husband died, she came to see me. I'd seen them as a couple, and then she came to see me alone, and she said, I'm almost 85 years old, and I have never had an orgasm. And she said, I don't want to die without ever having had an orgasm. Can you please help me with that? And she did learn how, and I've lost touch with her now, but it was sad, and it was wonderful that was something that she had really always wanted to do, and she was able to learn how. Because the penis, this is a Ginger Manley maxim, but the penis, when used alone, is about number 3 on a list of items that's likely to arouse a woman enough to lead to an orgasm. A vibrator is the most reliable sort of thing. The finger is second, and the penis is number 3. And that doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with penises at all. They're perfectly good. They do all kinds of wonderful things, and I'm frankly very fond of the one that I sleep with. But by itself, for most women, unless you're fairly young and fairly in hormone, running kind of crazy, by itself, it's not going to do it. So you've got to be flexible and creative enough to use something else. All right, so here's what I want you to take away from this. And we'll have an opportunity to do some discussion in just a few minutes. And then, as I said, I'll be available for the next 5 days at sea, and we'll talk about this some more. But if you're not having fun in whatever the experience is, it's time for a change. So I know that some of you have stories about ways that you've already begun to change, and we were talking a little bit before the class. Would you be willing just to say a little bit?
Because of your influence, I have learned to think about sex as in a global sense, rather than just as that kind of nasty little thing, off by itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I have even figured out how to come on to a man that I am having coffee with, and we're kind of tiptoeing in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I have figured out that I can simply say to him, if you want to, I would like to have a physical relationship with you.
And that's huge because you're not a teenager. Is that right? And so to find your voice at this stage in life, and just the glow that I can see on your face, I mean, you're just, you're warming up the whole room just talking about that. So that's really great. Thank you so much for sharing them.
Yes, I heard about some foods like avocados or cinnamon as aphrodisiacs. Would you please tell us more about certain foods that could affect good sex?
Well, there's been this quest forever to find the perfect aphrodisiac, and in my growing up, that was considered to be raw oysters was one of those, and we were always worried about there being saltpeter in the food because that was guaranteed to cut down on sexual interest. But the reality is there probably are not. I'm going to say probably. There probably are not any true aphrodisiacs. Avocados are wonderful for your heart health, and they're great tasting, and cinnamon is also. But certainly the spiciness of cinnamon and the way that can awaken your taste buds can be good, but we don't truly know any aphrodisiacs. But the whole sensuality of food when paired with someone that you love. I mean, if you think about the movie Tom Jones, in which Tom Jones and his mistress were absolutely devouring and having orgasmic experiences with the food, that's such a sensual kind of thing that we all can benefit from the sensuality of food, but there probably are not any true sexual foods, aphrodisiacs. But if you think it is, it might work. Placebo effect is wonderful.
I'm wondering, are affairs good for a marriage?
Most of the time, I would say not, because a marriage, in order to grow and thrive, really needs to have honesty. And for an affair to have any power at all, it has to take place. There has to be a degree of secrecy about it. So most of the time I would say not. Every now and then, however, I have heard stories, and I have no reason to not believe them, where one person has stepped out of the marriage and then has stepped back in. And as a part of that repairing the process, sometimes a marriage has been made much stronger. And I certainly would not recommend that a person have an affair for that. But there, in sort of the saving grace, looking at what might be able to come from something that could shatter a relationship. There have been some people that have been able to improve their marriage.
How do open marriages work?
How do open marriages work? Usually, well, open marriages have been around forever and ever. Generally, those are marriages in which once the child making and maybe the early child rearing has taken place, then one or both partners are free to engage in relationships outside. Generally, there is, if not an actual, there is an assumption that the other person knows what's going on. And somewhat of a freedom to be able to have sex outside of the relationship. I think in certain cultures and in certain status, in certain like the aristocracy in England and in any kind of royalty, that's generally been sort of the norm. But in terms of a rich relationship in which there's really equality within the marriage, I don't think that that's the way to have a good marriage. But people tell me that they work, and I don't know for sure. Yes?
What are the health benefits of orgasms and ejaculations?
Good question. Well, they feels really good for one thing, so it has enormous mental health benefit. For men, ejaculation helps to clear the prostate, so it's a there's some evidence that it helps to keep the prostate hypertrophy, the overgrowth of the prostate, to keep that down. There's not any evidence that it prevents prostate cancer, so we kind of can't go that far. For women, orgasm has no benefit other than total pleasure. There doesn't seem to be any physical benefit that because the entire sexual pleasure system for women only has one job, and that is to have orgasm, whereas for men, the penis has to deliver sperm, it has to urinate, and it has to get erections. And so for women, I think it's pretty much all a mental benefit. However, what happens is, in both men and women, if a person gets aroused and that arousal has a physical capacity to it, there's a whole buildup of blood in the pelvis, and if that arousal occurs and then there's not a release for that, then that can be very physically uncomfortable. In guys, the traditional language for that is blue balls, that a guy gets blue balls, and you don't know how many young women have been told, you've got to help me out here because I'm going to die of this horrible condition called blue balls. Well, the truth is, nobody's ever died of it that we know of. We don't have any death certificates that have that on there, but it can feel like you're going to die from it. I'm not a man, I can't speak to that directly, but a woman who gets aroused, and women get aroused much in the same way and don't reach orgasm, feel physically very bad. And so I'm highly in favor. I think, if not for just for pleasure, that's a good enough reason.